Milling Through History presents President's Day, Part 1. When it comes to President's Day, this is a day in which we are all supposed to honor and remember those men, at the time of this recording, who have become President of the United States. Sadly, the day has really devolved into more of an overglorified, let's try to put sales on different things and make people come out and spend money. But when it comes to President's Day, it was originally meant to honor George Washington, namely because his birthday was in February. Over time, Abraham Lincoln would be added on since his birthday was also in February, and the President's Day holiday fit right between the two men's dates of birth. Eventually, though, we would start to remember all the individuals who have become President of the United States, and so in this first part of a three-part series, we are looking at the different presidents of the United States and adding in a few unique, if not interesting, facts about their administrations. Now, be sure to add your own unique facts in the comments below. That way, people can learn about different parts of the presidency, and maybe even their favorite president had a story that you're more familiar with than other people might expect. So let's get in on our list of presidents. And we start with number 1, George Washington. Called the father of our country, George Washington certainly is always found within the top 3 of greatest presidents of all time. And as the man who goes ahead and begins the presidency, he is responsible for putting into place all the precedents that we take for granted. For instance, serving only 2 terms as president started with him. Of course, there's only been one person who has ever decided that 2 was not enough, but he comes at a later date and time. Rather uniquely to note, though, is that when it comes to Washington as president, perhaps of all the qualifications for the office that are found in the Constitution, the one that's unwritten is you have to be George Washington, as during the Constitutional Convention, all the individuals writing the document looked to him as an example of what a leader ought to be and asked themselves, what would Washington do if he had certain powers? This makes everybody else on the list of presidents have a really tough mountain to climb when trying to live up to the expectations of what would George Washington do. Number 2, John Adams. Immediately succeeding Washington, Adams found himself in a rather difficult position because he wasn't George Washington. As such, Adams also found that he was the first disliked president in the history of this nation, namely due to the fact that he created the Alien and Sedition Acts. These 2 acts, which attempted to limit the power of the press and also effectively deport anyone, especially immigrants who spoke out against the government, made him exceedingly unpopular. And as a result, it meant that Adams would really only be looking at a single term. Number 3, Thomas Jefferson. Now, arguably, Jefferson may have been the very first liberal president that the United States had ever seen. And part of that could be seen from the fact that he favored the French over the British. He also greatly weakened the military of the United States, leaving us in a very vulnerable state. However, he is most notably seen during his presidency for having doubled the size of the country with the Louisiana Purchase. During the second term of his administration, he found that rising tensions with the British were coming into play, namely with the Napoleonic Wars. However, Jefferson was able to avoid conflict and instead would leave out his successor, to actually figure out a way to handle Anglo and U.S. relations. Number 4, James Madison. James Madison was unfortunately left with a very difficult task on hand, namely, how does the United States deal with Great Britain? With Napoleon's France and the British Empire at war, Madison had to pick a side, and he wanted to remain neutral. However, there was a growing war hawk sentiment found within the government, and as such, with the British so distinctly distracted by Napoleon, never was there an opportunity to attack Canada and annex that part of the northern section of North America into the United States. Rather reluctantly, James Madison agreed, and in 1812, the War of 1812 began, or also referred to as Mr. Madison's War. Madison would see the United States really get beaten down on this one, and by all rights, we should have lost the war. But the Battle of New Orleans, where American forces led by Andrew Jackson proved to be an American victory. The timing of this, plus the Treaty of Ghent, allowed us to take out the semblance of victory from the jaws of defeat. And James Madison got really lucky in that respect. Number 5, James Monroe. Picking up the shattered pieces of the nation was James Monroe, who found himself needing to find a way to reunite the country. Yes, we were very happy that we won a war, but Monroe realized that sectional conflict was seemingly on the horizon, and so he would usher in what was referred to as the era of good feelings, and he did this in a rather interesting manner. His cabinet was made up of individuals representing the 3 distinct sections of the nation, North, South, and West. In doing this, all sections of the country could say that they had a voice that was speaking with the president. That might not seem like a really big deal today, but early 19th century politics, people were more concerned about what region they were from as compared to being part of the country as a whole. And so that really made a huge difference. James Monroe's presidency would also see the Missouri Compromise, wherein the nation would have to have an even number of both free and slave states. And this would actually begin the long march towards civil war. But at the time, nobody knew that was coming. Number 6, John Quincy Adams. The first of 3 presidents to find a presidential family dynasty being created, John Quincy Adams was the son of John Adams. As such, he really found himself in a rather difficult time with the presidency because of his election. It was exceedingly controversial and was decided thanks to the House of Representatives. And to be fair, it's not as if Adams was a very bad president, it's just that his defeated opponent spent 4 straight years battering him anytime anything went wrong. Now, one thing that Quincy Adams did do was help with the creation of the Smithsonian. And this is certainly something that tourists enjoy visiting today, but it's often forgotten. And so, when Adams found himself at the end of a single term, I'm sure he was very happy to finally be rid of his defeated opponent, except his defeated opponent was victorious. Number 7, Andrew Jackson. The now victorious defeated opponent, Andrew Jackson, would claim the mantle of the presidency, and in doing so, Jackson proved to be a rather unique figure, mainly because he did a lot of things nobody expected. For starters, he got rid of the national debt, the only president to ever do so. Good job. However, this is also a president without controversy. He would declare war on the Bank of the United States and effectively end a national banking system in this country. In addition to this, Andrew Jackson would also deal with the first real secession crisis, as South Carolina had threatened secession. Jackson's response to this was, if you secede, there's an army coming to bring you back in, and I will be at the head of this army. But perhaps the most notable thing Jackson is remembered for is the Indian Removal Act. Now, this act would see the forcible removal of all Native Americans from the eastern seaboard out towards the west. But Jackson, while he gets the blame for this, is not the president that actually initiated the process. That would be his successor. And it wasn't as if this was Jackson's idea. In reality, it was one of his predecessors, namely Thomas Jefferson. Number 8, Martin Van Buren. The successor of Jackson, Martin Van Buren's road to the White House is a rather unique one in the fact that he was a terminal bachelor. Jackson's cabinet took great issue with Jackson's decree that their wives had to go have tea with Peggy Eaton, the wife of the Secretary of War. As such, when they said that wasn't going to happen, Jackson said you can either resign or tell your wives what to do. Like many a good husband, they resigned and decided, nope, not going to go home to an angry wife. But Van Buren had no issues with this because he was a bachelor. And so this act of loyalty on Jackson's part was seen as something that he could admire. And with Jackson's approval, Van Buren became president. Now, unfortunately for Van Buren, though, economic crisis would be the big hallmark of his administration. And as such, it seemed almost impossible for him to succeed. But there is one aspect of Martin Van Buren which a lot of people don't realize. His nickname was Old Kinderhook, and his campaign slogan was, "Everything is okay." Number 9, William Henry Harrison. Historians debate the exact nature of William Henry Harrison, namely because he was only president for 30 days. You could argue he is the greatest president of all time, as no scandals were ever attached to him, or he is the worst president of all time, because he didn't do anything. That's really up to you. But what William Henry Harrison was is rather unique. He was the oldest person elected to office at the time. At the ripe old age of 60, there were debates from people in the press that he was too old to hold the executive office. As such, to prove that he was still just as good as all the young whippersnappers of the day, Harrison would go to give his inaugural address without wearing either topcoat or hat on a chilly March morning. Well, might not think too much of it by today's standards, as most inaugural addresses are only 10 minutes in length, but William Henry Harrison said, "No, my inaugural address will be 3 hours long." Kind of makes you think today's politicians are a little bit wimpy if they can't even get past 15 minutes on a speech. Who knew? Number 11, John Tyler. Now, John Tyler is a unique individual, as he was referred to as His Excellency while he was President of the United States. Now, this isn't exactly very fair to Tyler, as he is a rather important president. He was the president who set into motion the precedence of the vice president taking over in the event of the death of the president. At the time, nobody ever knew what to do. In fact, the Constitution was rather vague about the subject, mostly because, most likely, nobody ever expected this to occur. But Tyler would assume the reins of power, and in doing so, this angered the Whig Party. It also angered them when he would oppose much of their own political platform. He would also anger the Democrats, and as such, by the end of his administration, John Tyler found himself on the receiving end of being told, "You are the president of no one." No party wanted him, so he is effectively the first and only truly independent president in office at any given time. Number 11, James K. Polk. Now, James K. Polk is a rather unique figure, as he would see the admittance of Texas into the Union. And in addition to this, James K. Polk actually did everything he said he was going to do when it came to being president of the United States. He settled the border between Canada and the United States, specifically over the state of Maine. He would also get the country out of war debt, namely through the discovery of gold in California, and he successfully fought a war against Mexico in the U.S.-Mexican War. In addition to this, he would expand the size of the country by taking over all of what is now today the southwestern portion of the United States. All of this done in 4 years, rather unique to note. But sadly, after Polk left office, he passed away rather quickly. And so this rather dark horse president that most people forget should really be honored and remembered. And, as we all know, a high school was named after him, and a young football star named Al Bundy scored 4 touchdowns in a single game for Polk High. Number 12, Zachary Taylor. The first real wartime hero president to get elected into office, Zachary Taylor was referred to as Old Rough and Ready. And quite literally, this is a man who, if you decide to oppose him, he could probably beat you up just because he could. But one of the things that Zachary Taylor did rather quickly was he admitted California into the Union, and thus settled one of the big issues of, will California become a free or slave state? No, they're going to be free. But what he also saw through was the Compromise of 1850, which effectively ended the Missouri Compromise, thus creating an imbalance of both free and slave states, but also created, controversially, the Fugitive Slave Act, which would allow slave hunters to go into the North to capture runaway slaves and bring them back into the South. Now, this particular act was exceedingly unpopular by Northern abolitionists, and Taylor would have had to deal with their wrath. However, he died, which meant that in this case, he wouldn't have to deal with it, and instead, his successor would. Number 13, Millard Fillmore. If anyone had to take on the role of Unlucky 13, it had to be Millard Fillmore. I mean, with a name like Millard, you're pretty much set up for a disaster. How many Millards do you know? But for poor Millard Fillmore, he is an unfortunate individual in history, as he found himself dealing with the fallout of the Fugitive Slave Act. And because of its unpopularity, many people looked to him as being the scapegoat. Now, while this did certainly sour his presidency, he does have one big high note, and that Commodore Perry arrived to Japan at this time, and Millard Fillmore gets the credit for opening up relations for U.S.-Japanese relations. So, congratulations, Millard. That's a pretty good win. Number 14, Franklin Pierce. Now, Franklin Pierce comes into the presidency, and he is probably one of the more forgotten presidents we ever had. His administration is most notable for having passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which would create the two particular territories, namely Kansas and Nebraska. And it would also create the principle of self-determination, where these territories, when ready to become states, could vote on whether or not they would be a free or slave state. Now, this is rather unique, namely because the end result was Nebraska would become a free territory, while Kansas would become slave, and Kansas would effectively become a precursor of the Civil War. Be sure to check out our Season 1 episode called Bleeding Kansas to learn more about this particular incident, as you will find the detail there much more satisfying. Number 15, James Buchanan. Historians have often debated who is the worst president of the United States, and James Buchanan tends to make the top of that list. Buchanan is unique to note, namely because so many things have gone wrong with this particular administration. With the events of Bleeding Kansas going on, in addition to that, the fact that South Carolina and 7 states in the South all seceded during his administration, it's really no small wonder that Buchanan is looked down upon. It is generally believed that Buchanan was more or less just ready to say, sure, go ahead, let them leave. However, there was a huge sentiment of trying to preserve the Union. And as such, whether or not you might say, am I being rough on James Buchanan? In some ways, I think I'm kind of going easy on him and just trying to gloss over the fact that this is a president who allowed a civil war to occur in this nation. And as such, he would leave it to his successor to clean up the mess that he created. Now, be sure to come back to see part 2 of our look at President's Day and all the presidents of the United States, and we'll see exactly how the nation goes from this point forward. For more information, please consider these suggested titles. Be sure to click on the left-hand side of the screen to subscribe to our show, and on the right-hand side for our latest episode. And we will see you again for the next episode of Milling Through History.